Okay, we're going to talk about colonial governments a little bit. The first colony or the first English settlement here in the New World was Jamestown, Virginia, 1607. Starting with that point for about 150 years, Parliament took very little interest in colonial government. So we were self-governed. They were over there in England, we were over here, and obviously very little communication, very difficult to get from over there to over here. So we had a lot of self-control, low taxes, great deal of freedom, and that is until King George III takes power in 1760. That's 153 years later, and he decides, along with Parliament, that they need to deal more firmly with um, the colonies. Colonies developed their own forms of government and they created written constitutions. And if you remember, that's different than England. Britain did not have a actual written constitution, but a collection of documents and traditions and common laws. And the other thing they did was created limited governments. The idea of rule of law, where the officials were subject to the laws that they made. They created governments that had separate branches, and each one of them had separate powers. So the states individually created governments with a legislative branch in order to make laws, and they created bicameral legislatures, which meant they had two houses. They created an executive branch. These states had governors who were responsible for enforcing the laws, and they each had a judicial branch. And they had judges called magistrates whose responsibility was to handle conflicts over the laws. The other thing that they created with this was this idea of checks and balances. If you have three branches of government, each having their own responsibility, what they did was made almost everything a two-step to three-step process involving multiple branches so that they could check each other. So the legislative would make the laws, but then the executive would have to sign that or he could veto it. And then the judicial branch got to declare whether acts of the legislative or executive even went against the constitution of that particular state. Need for you to get the timeline into your notes. You should already have the Magna Carta in 1215, first real attempt at restricting the king's power. So we're going to skip forward to 1754 to 1763 in the French and Indian War, also known as the 7-Year War. It was called the French and Indian War here. In England, they called it the 7 Years' War. So once again, we are still, an English territory, and so together we are fighting the French. And because of the war, England incurred a lot of debt, and so they felt it was fair to ask the colonies to pay some of that taxes. And the colonies really didn't have a problem with that other than the fact that they didn't have any representation in Parliament. So then King George III takes the throne. And in 1765, what they do is institute what's called the Stamp Act, and sometimes called the stamp tax. It was not a tax on stamps. It was a tax on paper items, whether it's documents, playing cards, newspapers, anything with paper. And they had a stamp that when you purchased it, they would actually stamp the paper item itself. And the reason that England instituted this tax was to help pay back some of the war debts. And once again, the colonists were upset not because of the tax itself, but because they had no representation in England's government. So they are taxing without the consent of the people. And the thing that they would say all the time is taxation without representation. 5 years later, we have the Boston Massacre. This is an incident where you have the British soldiers there's only a few of them, and there are a mob of colonists. And somebody yells something, some shots are fired by the British soldiers, and there are a few people killed. But they all said that it was self-defense, that they did not attack the colonists, that the colonists actually attacked them. John Adams at the time hated England, hated the fact that the soldiers were in Boston, hated everything about it. He wanted independence more than any of the other founding fathers at that particular time. But he also felt that the British soldiers deserved a fair trial and deserved someone to represent them in this trial, especially if everything that he had heard in terms of the fact that it was self-defense and they did not attack the colonists. So John Adams defends the British soldiers and actually gets them acquitted, so they do not have to serve any jail time. or get executed for that matter. The next thing on our timeline, a few years later, we have the Boston Tea Party. England taxes tea, and I don't want to go into the details of that because it gets a little confusing, but I want you to know is that the colonists are upset once again. And so you have a group of patriots who dress up as Indians, they board the ships, and they toss the tea into Boston Harbor. 1774, we get the first Continental Congress, and basically what they did is they sent a petition to King and Parliament, and that's King George III, in an attempt to improve relations. This is what's going on here. These are our requests. We really don't want to go to war with you, but you're pretty much giving us no choice. They're still wanting that representation in Parliament, and with all of the things that they are doing here, quartering of troops in homes, just a bunch of things without going into a lot of detail. But then we have April 19th, 1775. So up till this point, I want you to know the order of everything. I don't even necessarily want you to know the year. I just need for you to know what caused what. We have the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War, which, you know, when King George III comes to power, he institutes a tax to help pay for that. The colonists are angry. They're tired of the British soldiers being here. We have the Boston Massacre. Then we have the Boston Tea Party. Then we have the Continental Congress sending a request saying, please stop doing all of these things. Then on April 19th, 1775, Lexington and Concord is sometimes referred to as the shots heard round the world because this is the start of the Revolutionary War. So what if you are familiar with the ride of Paul Revere at all, that took place this evening. He's riding around telling everyone that the British are coming, that they are heading to Concord where there is an armory of weapons, and they're trying to get there and get them before the colonists can use them. July 4th, 1776, the other date you need to know is the writing or the signing actually of the Declaration of Independence.